My name is Andrew Caracciolo. I am co-chair of the AIA New York Historic Buildings Committee. It's nice to see so many familiar faces here. We have a few other events planned this fall that I'd like to tell you about. We are going to have our monthly committee meeting at Carlo Zesikowski's office. He's going to host us and make a presentation himself. That's on September 23rd, and it's Midtown. Details to follow. On October 19th, Jeremy Woodruff is going to, Jeremy Woodruff is going to give us a tour of Prospect Park, highlighting the Litchfield Mansion, which he is quite passionate about. And then on November 10th, Angel Ayan, who's an active member of our committee, is going to interview Rosa Loninger, who wrote a fantastic book called Well Time. And it's about her family's experience leaving Germany, going to Havana, and staying there for decades until the revolution, and ending up in Miami. And she has just an unbelievable family story to tell. And then she went on to be a preservationist. And so I think that's going to be really fantastic. And that's November 10th. Okay. Moving up back to this evening, we have Gregory Dietrich, who is principal of Gregory Dietrich Preservation Consulting. And he's going to be moderating our event. And the panelists are Kate Wood, who's a former executive director of Landmarks West and principal of Worth Preserve. And then finally, or next I should say, excuse me, Kevin Wolf is an architect and landscape architect who is instrumental in the creation of the Douglaston Manor Historic District. And then finally we have Michael Goldblum, who is a Landmarks Preservation Commissioner, and with active practice doing lead homes, houses of worships, and we're lucky to have all of these fine people speaking this evening. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Kate and let her make a presentation to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am, funny enough, going to start tonight's presentation off about 100 miles north of New York City. So it's going to be up to Gregory to figure out how to weave this all together into the story, the 60th anniversary of New York City landmarks. But is anybody here addicted to real estate websites? Anybody? It's okay. It's a safe space, you can admit it. So imagine if real estate listings were truly unvarnished. Instead of charming historic home with character, they said, step inside this 150-year-old abandoned, mechanically obsolete forever project and try not to fall into the gaping hole in the floor while you admire the collapsing plaster overhead. Most people would run away screaming, right? Anyone who wouldn't, those are my people. So preservation issues aren't always so obvious. I mean, we've all seen them. The old houses that have been hastily zhuzhed up. I'm not pointing fingers at this house that's been painted black in Hudson, New York, but maybe I am. Sort of zhuzhed up for a sale, leaving the unsuspecting new homeowners holding the bag for decades of remodeling and deferred maintenance. They may find that their charming historic home is actually a sad and dysfunctional echo of itself, a Frankenstein of incompatible parts that no longer work as a cohesive whole. But there's this sweet spot, if you can find it, if you can get in there at just the right moment where there's this opportunity to preserve and restore original character-defining features while making strategic improvements to bring the building into the 21st century. And that sweet spot is called historic rehabilitation. And that's where I come in. So my mission is to help homeowners become stewards of and advocates for the old houses that they've chosen to love. So I'm Kate Wood, and over the past decade, I've carved out a niche as a historic rehabilitation strategist. I named my firm Worth Preserving because that's what I do. I help people understand what's significant, what's special about their historic homes, the features that no matter what other changes are made, those features that need to be preserved. And then I work like mad to share that understanding with everyone involved in the project, the architects, the interior designers, contractors, building inspectors, vendors, historic district commissions, so that they can work their magic towards that vision. So this introduction is a bit different than the one I used for the previous 15 years plus of my career, when I ran an advocacy group that you may have heard of. Back then, I would start out every public testimony with, Landmark West is a not-for-profit community organization committed to the preservation of the architectural heritage of the Upper West Side. This Certificate of Appropriateness Committee wishes to comment on the application to fill in the blank. Replace windows, change a storefront, build a tower. So at Landmark West, we went up against some of the most powerful developers in the city, which is to say some of the most powerful developers in the world, on behalf of neighbors who wanted to save their stoops, cornices, human scale, and sense of place. But inevitably, we also ended up against some neighbors and their architects, contractors, lawyers, etc., whose top priority was not historic preservation. And in some cases, they talked the talk, but they didn't walk the walk. So often, I would find myself thinking, usually after a very late night at the community board, why can't we all just get along? So I'm not so naive as to, this is me now in one of my projects, so I feel like I look a lot happier in my current role. So I'm not so naive to believe that everyone can be or wants to be convinced of the value of historic preservation. But I do dream of a world where preservation, and especially historic rehabilitation, isn't the perennial underdog, and it isn't considered the domain of quirks and nostalgists, where preservation is given the credit it deserves as a reasonable, mainstream, enriching, and responsible form of development. I think all of us here tonight are in some capacity in the business of education. That's the primary mission of the Center for Architecture. And as architects, preservationists, consultants, we're uniquely positioned to have significant influence with the people who hire us. And project by project, we need to defend that position. Our clients hire us because they trust us. We can help them in ways that no one else can, and we can reinforce the fact that wanting to preserve something doesn't make them kooky or eccentric. It's reasonable. So here's an example of a project that I'm working on now in Hudson, New York. I am not drawing up the construction documents. I'm not laying brick or running electrical. What I am doing is starting with two questions with the clients who recently bought this house. What do you need from your house? And what does your house need from you? So homeowner and house on equal footing. It's a relationship. So from there, I create a historic rehabilitation strategy. It's part conditions assessment, part preservation recommendations, part roadmap. And again, starting with those character-defining features, what's worth preserving? And we go from there. So these are not homeowners who necessarily identify as preservationists. They do recognize that they bought a beautiful 1870s house that has survived pretty much intact, and they do not want to be the ones to mess it up. But they do want a functional family home for the 21st century. And one really hideous bathroom, an illegal third-floor bedroom, and Frankenstein systems just don't cut it. And while we're at it, we might as well restore the missing plaster moldings, the original windows, and about $1 million worth of other things. So fortunately, this house qualifies for New York State Historic Homeowner Tax Credits, as do thousands of homes in broad swaths of New York City. It's a tool that's not talked about enough, and it's something that architects should absolutely be discussing with their historic rehab clients. Realtors should also be a mouthpiece for this tool. So tax credits offer a really nice, juicy carrot. 20% of all qualifying rehab expenses back in your pocket in the form of a state income tax credit. So thanks to me, my mom hasn't paid state taxes in years, and it's totally legal. But beyond the financial incentives and even beyond the regulatory imperatives, this house, this 1870s house in Hudson, is in a designated historic district. And the benefit of having a preservation plan is that then it becomes the narrative for the project. It's that connective tissue that keeps everyone pulling in the same direction and feeling like their contributions matter. And they do. I mean, it's a big picture. We know that climate change is a real thing, and that we can't continue to be a disposable society. So preservation is so much more than aesthetic taste. It's even more than economics. When I help someone create a new bathroom in an 1870s house, it's with the idea, first of all, that we're not going to destroy any significant features that already exist. So we're going to get that plumbing in without creating a bump out or anything like that that's going to destroy the ornamental plaster ceiling below. And second, that bathroom will be so beautiful, functional, and integrated with the story of the house that it too will be worth preserving. Like a 1930s bathroom added to a 19th century house. Now that's something I would definitely lie down in front of a bulldozer to save. And here's a larger point. When homeowners go through this process, when they're given the information, guidance, and support they need, they become advocates themselves. They start to see their house as not just a fixer-upper, but as a cultural artifact with a story to tell, and that they are part of that story. And they learn how to ask the right questions, how to find the right people, how to care for their house over time. And if I could choose a motto, it would be, fixer-uppers no more. They should not happen. And that's crucial, because if the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was created 60 years ago to fight the big battles, designating landmarks, stopping demolitions, saving neighborhoods, the next 60 years will depend on homeowners, communities, and trades who know how to take care of what we've already saved. So we're not antiquarians. We're not the taste police. We're doing our part to save the world. And I'm going to end with this project. It's a circa 1876 train depot in Copiague, New York. It's been abandoned since the 1930s and is now being adapted for residential use with both state and federal tax credits. Is this project rational? Financially, no. Is the owner a little crazy? Yeah. Absolutely. She's also one of the bravest people I know. And in all this reasonable talk about the benefits of historic preservation, I still want to leave room for the white elephants in the passion projects. So thank you very much.
So my name's Kevin Wolf. I'm a Queens boy. I grew up in Douglaston, Queens, and tonight I'm going to show you two districts in Queens that I advocated with many other people in Douglaston 30 plus years ago when I was young. Remember that part? And it was a long battle, or battles, because there were two districts. So I want to start with Dorothy. She's the one who gets what Douglaston is about. And coincidentally, the developers of the Douglas Manor district that we're going to talk about tonight, they were from Kansas too. So these places, I'm sure most of you know, are the result of the rail lines that started to be built from New York City out to the island. Queens was originally part of the island. 1898 is consolidation. The tunnels are what makes, the electrification of the tunnels are what makes these places happen. And there are 175 of them in Queens alone that are built before 1930 that are similar to Douglaston and Douglaston Hill, the two places we're going to talk about. Whoa. So that circle, that's Douglaston. It's as far out as you can go and still be in New York City. From my house, you can throw a rock and be in Nassau County, and the dot is Penn Station, 12 miles. This map on the left, it's a peninsula, it's a mile long, and that was the original Douglas estate, 175 acres roughly. And the purple is the Douglaston Historic District. And when we started this project, the idea, this is Northern Boulevard here, and the other white horizontal is the railroad. The idea was that the entire peninsula would get landmarked. The first part of it, Douglaston Hill, was subdivided in 1853, Douglas Manor in 1906. And so the train is what made it happen. So just as Kitty Hawk was happening, they weren't flying planes over Douglas Manor, but this is a bird's eye rendering. It's a mile-long peninsula that had been an estate and an arboretum at the same time. The owner of that, William P. Douglas, collected trees from all over the world. The Parsons Nurseries here in New York were some of his best friends. And the mile-long shoreline that runs along here, the radical notion of those Kansans was that everyone owns it in common. It's all single-family houses. It's all part of the Garden City movement. And that mile-long landscape is still here today, 120 years later. So this is what it looked like just after the estate was subdivided and they started selling lots. It was the country and the city. This is the time of malaria, yellow fever, things we don't even talk about, no air conditioning. There was a dock, and this is one of the roads that everyone shared in common. This is the mansion, 1819. The Douglases had this for 70 years. And when they promoted this, the Rickard Finley Company, we're talking about Douglas Manor right now, they said it would take 20 minutes to Herald Square meeting Penn Station. It's still a half hour. You still can't get there in 20 minutes, but it sounded really good. The houses were the typical eclectic houses of the time. This is middle to upper middle class. Some of the lots were as small as 40 by 100. There was no zoning in New York City. So the Rickard Finley Realty Company zoned the peninsula themselves and said on the east side facing mud flats at low tide, 40 by 100. On the west side facing Long Island Sound, a minimum of 100 by 100. So you got relatively modest houses like that, and then you got 15-room mansions like the one on the bottom. The residents who came here to live, artists, business people, bankers, and some movie stars like Ginger, who rented this very modest house when she was 19, the year before she met Fred and danced her way to fame in Hollywood. By the 1980s, the McMansion phenomenon started, and some of these houses just were going down left and right. That's when I came back to New York to study architecture, and would go and visit my folks, and that's how I got sucked into this. The evil twins are the developers just putting up, the same house over and over again. So initially, as I said, the goal was the hill, 1850s at the base. That's between Northern Boulevard and the railroad tracks, and the manor, Douglas Manor, the rest of it that I've been showing you images of. We hired a bunch of consultants. The first thing that happened is Landmarks, so single-family freestanding houses. Not interested, guys. We don't do that. So we embarked on a campaign of finding out as much as we could about this place, who the people were, who the architects were, who the artists were, to convince them. That was a 9-year process, 3 commissioners. Each of those commissioners came out to Douglaston, did a walk with the group that I was with, the local historical society that got formed. Oh, it's a lovely place, no thanks. And the second one said, yeah, we'll do this. 2 days later, I got a call and she never said that. You never heard that, that was wrong. But finally, the third one relented. And in 1997, Douglas Manor and a few houses outside of it were designated. So the map on the left, it's 600 houses, and that's the upper purple part. And then we were left with the hill. So Douglas Manor, 188 acres, a mile of waterfront, and a 600-year-old white oak tree that was the oldest on Long Island. The hill was a slightly different animal. Front porches, it's a little older. It didn't really get developed till the 1890s, even though it was subdivided. So it was subdivided in a way that was becoming popular in 1853. 1-acre lots, 200 feet deep. So the blocks here are very deep from the manor. There's no waterfront, even though it's close to the manor, and it's a block from the railroad station. But it didn't take off. And first of all, they subdivided it in 1853. There was no railroad. So they had to wait until 1866. But it wasn't until the 1890s when houses like this started to get built. So by the time this got designated in 2004, we started this in 1989. The 150 houses that are here, there were only about 35 that were in a coherent state adjacent to each other to make up a district. So that's what time does. And that's the district. It's a very typical New York City district on the left, where you can see it's a little wonky and it butts up right against the railroad tracks. So what are the challenges of designing as an architect in a place like this? Well, the first thing is you're dealing with every side of the building. It's not a brownstone district. And yet some of the lots are really small, so you can't always see what's happening. So the commission has lots of variables on how they rule on stuff here. And there are gardens, which I have a blast with if I get hired to do one, but everyone always runs out of money by the time you get to the garden. And then what's appropriate for an addition? These are houses that no one's going to say you can't do an addition because you have extra land. You have a lot at 60 by 100, 100 by 100. This house got doubled in size after designation, and the adjacent lot was a ranch house, and the ranch house got torn down because it was non-contributing to make a garden for that house. So suddenly there are other possibilities when you do landmarking and designation. People weren't sure what you do, how you do it, what's appropriate. So here we are, 27 years later. People have restored, some very modest little houses that are part of the district. They've done additions, they've done restoration work. They've taken houses that were down on their heels, even though these are $1 million houses, and restored them, pumped them up, as Kate just said, for 21st century living. There's a lot of stuff that goes on inside, and what Kate showed looks like a lot of houses in Douglaston on the inside as well. It's very similar. Historic materials suddenly are back. So the upper left and the lower left are restoration of this house, and in addition, sometimes old additions get removed, like this one on the lower left. And new construction. If there's an empty lot, there are about 20 of them left. And if there's a non-contributing building, if you have a plan, you can replace the non-contributing building, tear it down, and start over, which is what happened with this house. At the Hill, the same kind of things have been happening. Here's a house. The lower left is 1940, the tax photo. The upper left is at designation in 2004, and this is what it looks like today after a restoration. This is on a 200-foot deep lot. There's a pool in the back, there's a carriage house that got restored, as well as additions. But there were failures too. Between the hill and Douglas Manor was another section. This section was where Irish immigrant farmers built houses for themselves to work on the Douglas estate. And this is one of the wonderful ones on the left. We tried to do in 2008 a extension of the district. Landmarks actually calendared it. But by 2016, because of developer opposition and people wanting to flip their houses and afraid of landmarks, despite all the information we got out, it didn't happen. And now, this is what it looks like. You didn't like that? This is what's happening, and this is the way it is. The other thing that never happened was there's another section that flanks the peninsula called Sand Hill Road. And this was a colony of freedmen who worked Little Neck Bay for oysters. I'm sure you've all heard of Little Neck clams. That's what they did for a living. And this cottage on what we call the back road, Sand Hill Road, when this got brought up is, we should be doing something about this. People on the committee that I worked with were like, why? What's the importance of this? You know, this is 20 plus years ago, of course, and our sensibilities have changed. But as you can see, the middle slide, bottom, this is about to come down. It's the last one of the colony that's left. There are about 35 houses, and it's an extraordinary place and story. We don't know a lot about it because not a lot of research has been done, but this starts in the 1850s. Some of you may know Sandy Ground in Staten Island is another place that's similar to this, where people who were freed or born free came to work the oyster beds, the marine trade. And so this place is the last one that's left. And then I asked the question, what is the future? We started with Dorothy, we'll end with you know who. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm Michael Goldblum. For the last 15 years, I've had a great job, a job if I can figure out how to get paid for it, I quit my day job, and that's being a commissioner at the Landmarks Commission. And it's made available to me, a person who has a small practice, a small partnership. It's made available to me amazing resources, being able to meet amazing architects, learn from experienced preservationists, historians, learn about the city that I live in and that I raised my family in a way that has exposed me to much more than I could have ever seen from my own practice. I was never trained as a preservationist. I wound up doing a lot of preservation-oriented work in Fieldston, which is near where I live, before I was on the commission, and I was the beneficiary of a Bronx person retiring from the commission, so I was the fish in the small pond to get the job, and I've been very honored to have it. I'm honored to be here tonight. I didn't quite understand the term maverick. I wouldn't call myself a maverick. I doubt my kids would call me one, but I did want to touch on the descriptions noting that we were going to talk about triumphs and challenges. So I thought about what have been the triumphs and challenges that I've faced at the Commission, and there have been a lot over 15 years. There have been many votes and deliberations that have taken place in that I thought yielded amazing things, whether it was the restoration of a building that was in poor shape, protection of the district that was previously unprotected, the creation of a new building that was enriching the understanding of the historic place in which it was located. There have been, fortunately, a lot of those. There have also been an awful lot of deliberations and votes where I would classify the result challenge, either because I struggled with it and thought that it was ultimately appropriate, but had later come to see that we shouldn't have voted for it, or I shouldn't have voted for it, or where I disagreed with others and found myself in the minority. But I was only given a few minutes, so I don't want to go through too many of those, and I thought it might be useful to look at an issue that was both, for me, a triumph and a challenge, and that's townhouses. Most of you probably know a little bit about townhouses, being from New York. Quickly, townhouses are probably the quintessential residential form in New York City, or one of the few. From the earliest times, that was how New Yorkers housed themselves. From federal buildings in the 18th and 19th centuries to the other styles that were built up into the mid-20th century, they are a remarkable type. And I think that over the years that I've been on the Commission, the most common thing that we see is people wanting to modify townhouses. So even though they may not be the sexiest projects that people get all riled up about, or there's protests or media coverage about them, they, as a group, are the biggest thing I think that we, as commissioners, govern. And they range from obviously the fronts are protected by the Commission, the volume's protected by the Commission, the interior is generally not, unless it's an unusual situation. But also over my time on the Commission, the backs of townhouses have come to be protected as well. It's a little bit of a controversial notion because the Landmarks law was written to protect the public manifestation of the buildings and not their private spaces. And some could make an argument that the interior courts created by townhouses are not public. They're private property, they're owned by individuals. What are you doing messing with my backyard? But the Commission has, over the past couple of decades, taken the position that backyards in townhouses, these courtyards that we call donuts, are semi-public, and that they have a value and merit protection as part of districts and as individual landmarks when that applies. And so when people come to apply to us for townhouse work every week, they're looking usually to modify the backyards. So I just wanted to show you a few different kind of backyards. Here's a shot from the Upper East Side, where what you see in the back is a real mess. Every townhouse is different height, different roof, different width. The backyards are really cut up with intrusions and bumps and all kinds of incursions that create not a very unified space. This is Ridgewood. So this is probably the opposite. This is incredibly uniform blocks that it's a relatively recent district, but it's been relatively under-modified. It was up until relatively recently not affluent place. And it retains its form from when it was built remarkably consistently. You can see in the backs, the fronts all have these bay windows, a lot of the backs have bay windows here too. It's very, very uniform. All built probably at the same time by the same 1 or 2 or 3 developers. And this is Prospect Heights, where you have a little bit of both. You have some uniformity. You can see these kind of bay window extensions that go along the back, or some of that lower extensions. A few have these little L's that pop off. That's probably the most common thing that you see on a townhouse, is those little L's. Of course, nowadays we have a different take on what happens in backyards, but originally when they were built, these were single-family homes, of course, but shortly, after their initial home ownership phase, they became divided into multifamily buildings for the most part. And the backyards were generally quite utilitarian, not in all cases, but in most. And when they were made into multifamily buildings, they were often places for laundry, places for the bathroom, places for the kitchen. They were not the focus of entertainment. They were not a place you hang out. They were utilitarian spaces. But once white people in the 70s started to kind of rediscover cities and go back in, these buildings changed hands and started to become single-family houses once again. Most of the, when they come to, when people buy a house, they generally want to change it to suit their lifestyle, and we try to accommodate that. The way that that's become accommodated over my time in the commission has been to develop a standard. And that standard tries to balance the need for change and the change in lifestyle of the people who occupy the buildings with a desire to preserve the form of the spaces, of these donuts, of these back courtyards, to preserve the form and try to strike a balance. So the model that we've developed, and it's been done hundreds, if not more times, by different architecture firms, is to basically allow people to modify, basically to remove those little tails and those little excrescences that go along many of the old townhouses that usually house kitchens or bathrooms or service spaces, to remove those and to put a larger volume starting at the ground level, going up maybe 1 or 2 or 3 stories, and going the full width of the townhouse. Very few of the original townhouses, when they were designed and built, had full width rear yard additions. Some did, but most didn't. But this model of allowing for full width townhouses, this was a project that was presented, I think last week, 2 weeks ago in Brooklyn. You can see a full width townhouse with a balcony above it. Here's another one that shows a 2-story townhouse. And the balance that we tried to strike was, you can change the bottom, you can do an addition that's kind of quiet, isn't too flashy. Because over the years, many of these districts already had modifications, whether that was something, before it was Landmarks, so it was relatively rare to see an untrammeled block, at least in many locations. But the decision was to try to hold on to the volume of the building, the expression of the volume, and we felt that kind of being in that space, being in the courtyard space, you kind of read it, because they're now all full of trees and plantings and fences, you read it at the top. You read it at the edge where it met the sky. So we wanted to try to keep the volume of the buildings, at least at the top floors, in its historic form, both to read that courtyard and to read the building itself. So the thing that struck me about this as being a triumph is that really, what the commission has done, and is, in concert with homeowners week after week, is to change the Noli map of New York City. For those of you who know, the Noli map is a very famous map in Rome that was developed in the Baroque period that has become for architects and planners a kind of meme that expresses a way to look at a city. You look at a city through the voids that are created by the buildings, the public spaces, and the private spaces, interiors and exteriors. And our version of the Noli map is the Sanborn map. And if you look at the old Sanborn maps, this is from area of Brooklyn, you can see the original Noli map of Brooklyn. All those tails, all those little tails up there. Some didn't have it, but a lot of them had it. So the Noli map of New York looked like that. But now, over time, it's changing to look like that. And there you see, this was a project that was also recently up. The top part is actually not in the district, but it was the only one I could find at short notice. But you see that a lot of these houses show full width additions. This is in a neighborhood that has been discovered, let's say, and a lot of people have changed their little tails into full width additions. And so, in a way, the commission is remaking the map of historic New York by putting in place a standard and allowing for that to go forth through the market as people do stuff to their homes. But then comes the challenge. Every time somebody buys a townhouse that used to be a apartment building or 4-apartment building, they're taking out 7 of 8 or 3 of 4 residences. This is from a still from a great movie with Beau Bridges, 1970, called The Landlord. And it takes place in a horrible, decrepit slum called Park Slope. This naive white guy goes in, buys a building with his rich parents' money, and decides he's going to make it fantastic, and of course, he winds up meeting with adventures. But it's a great kind of encapsulation of the naivete and lack of sensitivity to culture, race, economics that it embodied this era. And we're still in this era to some significant extent. The connection between preservation and gentrification is problematic. You can say that which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's a very complicated thing, and there's different reports that say different things. But if preservation is going to thrive, I think it has to figure out how to do so without displacing communities and without being used by some as a tool for stopping reasonable development and the accommodation of people of different incomes and backgrounds in the city. We protect the buildings, we don't protect the occupants. We protect the storefront, we don't protect the store. There are many places that have laws that do protect special places, special people, special jobs. We're not one of those places. And so if you're advocates, if you think that this is important, you should think about talking to your legislators and encouraging a broader view, perhaps, of what preservation should be. So for me, the challenge is the cultural aspect of what we do, and it's something that does concern me. This is a shot of another one of those post-renovation townhouses that shows it's no longer a multifamily house. It strikes me that the model that we've developed takes into account another very interesting social change, which is that people no longer, the backs of the townhouses are kind of representative of how we live today. Whereas in the 1870s, even those guys who had the bay window extensions and who had nice rooms in their backyards, they would have blanched at the notion of a double high glass wall at the back of their house. It's not private. It's lit up all night long, and everyone's seeing into my living, but that's part of how we live now. And the model, just like those little tales represented how people lived in 1870, 1880, these represent how we live today. Thanks.
So, hello everyone. My name is Gregory Dietrich. I'm a preservation consultant, but I've also spent many years in preservation advocacy as well. And I was actually quite interested in this particular selection of panelists tonight because there is overlap, but then there's also distinction. So Michael largely focused on his work at LPC, but he does have a thriving practice, and got a chance to look at the site. So designer, commissioner. We've got Kevin, who also has a quite impressive firm as an architect and landscape architect, which you didn't touch so much on, but in addition to his activism, his longtime activism. And then we have Kate, who basically was heading one of the heaviest hitting preservation advocacy organizations for 15 years, and for now, I guess, a decade, has been working as a historic rehabilitation strategist, which I have to say, I do a lot of research just on who's my competition and all. And
I'm not competing with you.
as I noticed, and this is a new term for me, and actually it makes perfect sense that this would be something that she would be exploring, and basically taking her sum of experience and applying to this work. It's not lost on me that we are gathered here tonight on the 24th anniversary of the 9/11 attack. And so I did just want to say that although we're not looking at the memory of that event tonight, we are looking at preserving memory of place through the buildings that we know and love as New Yorkers. And so with that, I would like to just pose some general questions to the panel, and then I'll have some more specific ones, and then we'll follow by opening up the floor. All right. So, question one. What do you see as the current challenges confronting designation and regulation of historic properties in New York City and elsewhere, since you did allude to upstate as well, and anybody's included?
I just want to make note of the fact that when Michael's talking about the donut, I mean, that was in its infancy, that idea, when I was, first starting out at Landmark West. I mean, it was something that we were talking about, and people were like,
Garden core.
yeah, exactly. But the fact that it's still, something, and I feel like there has been evolution in the way that the commission deals with that, because I remember fighting for this idea that you have to preserve some sense of the integrity of the rear facade, and it's heartening to find that there has been some change in the position of the commission, and hopefully in the position of the architects who are working with homeowners and kind of their ideas. It's interesting though, I remember when I was just leaving Landmark West and sort of being shocked by people were starting to go underground and build the pools and the gyms, and it's like, okay, we can't, invade the green space, but we're going underneath. Which, there's a whole environmental argument for preserving the donut also, because it's that sort of permeable green space and the lungs of the city and, all of that. So it's like, the issues are still there, they're morphing.
Absolutely. One of the things that, on that point, not that it addresses it by any means, but the real switch, I think, in terms of the commissions, or switch is the wrong word, the real kind of shift that represents the current status is when this kind of addition became approvable by the staff. And one of the aspects of it was that we required them to maintain at least, I think it's 3-5 feet at the back of the property as being virgin soil, so that planting could occur along the fence line, which is where most of it does anyway. And yeah, we could talk forever about the economic insanity of some of the projects that one sees, but that's for another time.
It's also like that question of kind of what then becomes the norm. Because if the norm then is like you bump out the rear facade of all these buildings, then that's like the new line. And I'm sure it's, you know, even in neighborhoods like Douglaston where, you know, you've got these kind of buildings in the round. And it's, I remember with rooftop additions too, it's like somebody put up a rooftop addition, you knew before long everybody was gonna start putting up their rooftop additions because you gotta keep bumping up to see over your neighbor, around your neighbor. And so it's like, you know, we get used to certain patterns and then that becomes sort of the baseline for changes moving forward.
I would say both of these things are true. In Douglaston, for example, the setbacks are 30 feet. Now with City of Yes, not to get into another tangle, but City of Yes has changed all the setbacks to be much less. And so you can build a much bigger envelope even in the historic district. You can't build the ADUs and some of the things that have come up. But I would say the thing that strikes me about preservation going forward is really about what's it going to be? You mentioned the next 60 years. That's why my last slide says what it does, because in a place like Douglaston, which I see most intimately like you do, Riverdale, I see the violations every day. And you know, when Douglaston and the Hill were designated, there were like 70 districts. I think there were 130, 140, something like that. Oh, thank you, Simeon, more.
Over 150.
Over 150. So regulating all of that, and the staff never seems to get bigger from what I see. Oh, we did. But that's a lot to regulate, and what they regulate and how they regulate it. And in Douglaston, you know, you can impact the integrity of a house by buying a Home Depot front door, but no one's going to come after them for that. So there's this little incremental decay going on.
And then so-and-so has it, so why can't I have it?
Yeah, and then I just see, I just wonder who's going to have the enthusiasm for this going forward. You people seem to, but what about everyone else? It doesn't seem to be much of a priority.
Kevin, I have sort of a question specific to the suburban nature of the Douglaston districts. And one was, what was your takeaway in terms of the commission, the various chair or commissioners' objection to moving forward with that particular idea of a suburban district?
Yes, well, we got lots of coaching and help from Historic Districts Council early on. Simeon over here was part of that. I would say that the biggest thing that I mentioned briefly is the idea of designating eclectic suburban architecture 35 years ago. It was just, you know, they had designated Dippus Park, which in Brooklyn, but no one was much interested in that at all at that time. It was something that really took a lot of education, and no one knew about Douglaston. Like Douglaston has a rich social history as well. There are a lot of artists, George Gross, some of you may know, that lived there. You know, up until 1930, there were theater stayed, but movie people went out to California. So there were a lot of interesting people that had lives there. And the suburbs didn't have the post-war slur of being a stagnant, boring place. It wasn't Levittown, it was connected to the city. People lived full lives, but they wanted this little bit of green. And that little bit of green could happen on a 40 by 100 lot. And for a middle-class family, that was heaven. They fled Manhattan. You know, again, there was no zoning when these places were built, so they did deed restrictions that created a zoning of its own kind. And that was groundbreaking. And to share a mile-long waterfront, so even if you bought the most modest lot at 40 by 100, or you built a 15-room mansion, you had the same access. That's radical, really radical.
Do those deed restrictions still exist?
They do,
Okay.
and they win in court all the time.
Okay.
Until now, I don't know what's going to happen.
So people fight for them or against them?
Yes, for
For
them.
them, okay.
Yeah.
And also, just another related question about, you talked about the historic arboretum that
Yes.
was there. Do trees ever figure into Commissioner?
Yeah, so
decisions?
there's a master plan guidelines that the commission did with our input. And so they have fairly loose, like if you go to Long Island, you can breathe on a tree and you'll get arrested in some places. But here they did, if it's over a foot in diameter, you need a permit to remove it.
Okay.
But people, remove trees left and right. And part of what I'm talking about when I say I see the erosion is that the tree crews come, they don't have a permit, they cut the tree down, the tree is gone. You can't replace a 100-year-old tree.
The oak tree?
Yeah, so I showed you the 600-year-old oak tree, and that was in front of a 1960s ranch house, and the owner was desperate to sell it as a buildable lot. The ranch house person who built it 60 years ago had built it at the back of the lot, got a special dispensation from New York City DOB to do that when 1961 zoning came in. And we had a storm, this is about 10 years ago, a branch fell on his house. He went through 12 arborists before he found one who said the tree is dangerous and it must be removed. And it got removed. And that was like, spear through the heart. It really was. That was the oldest tree on Long Island according to accounts.
Behind my office.
Sorry?
An elm was removed behind my office on State Street in Brooklyn Heights. The Dutch elm, the original old elm. It was a block that really didn't have any, Dutch elm spreads underground. And it was completely sealed off, except for a 3-foot spot all the way, far away from the tree. And it wasn't gonna get it, it was gonna die. And the city had owned the building and sold it to, because there's a funny story, the commissioner of education, I guess, of the schools, the commissioner of schools, was staying in Brooklyn Heights at a hotel until they figured out where he was going to live. And he said, why don't you buy this house? And Brooklyn Heights is a big house for sale. I'll be happy to live there. And a couple of them lived there. And then the next guy wanted to go to Staten Island and live there. I just figured the city should have just kept the building, the tree. But they sold it. And the new owner of a land rental, same story. The tree dropped a limb and crushed his brand new fence and
this was especially sad because the family that built this house and lived there for 50 plus years just nurtured this tree. They did everything right, they wired it, it stretched the whole width of the 80-foot wide lot. It was unbelievable.
I think the point is that, we as people, we're just passing through.
Right.
Like, we're stewards of these places. And, just because we want, the tree to be gone, or we want, something that, I always try to I think that's what preservationists do best. We take the long view and think, okay, but these buildings have survived for generations before us. They're here and they're well built. They should last for many generations more. And just helping people understand how to live in old buildings, because it's possible.
Just want to kind of do a little redirect here, but Michael, I am really interested in this sort of the two hats that you wear as an architect and as a commissioner. And I was curious as to, with all the presentations that you see every Tuesday at the commission, what do you believe constitutes a good presentation? And also, if the bones are there for a good proposal, but the presentation is not very polished, does that affect how the commissioners are going to respond? Just, I know it's a pretty broad question.
Yeah. I think that it's definitely true that if someone shows up with a bad presentation, we notice it. And there was a restaurant it was somewhere in Brownstone, Brooklyn, about a month ago, where it was a corner restaurant, and they put up like a sidewalk shed thing, you know, like a restaurant extension, a COVID thing, and they wanted to kind of institutionalize it. And the owner hired an interior designer, I believe, and they both showed up with these drawings. Not a single drawing matched. Their presentation was very, let's say, impressionistic. And
not a good word.
It was totally wacky and chaotic. And our reaction was, boy, these guys are at sea. Let's see if we can help them out. And we tried to kind of figure out what it was that they wanted to do and see if it was okay by our normal standards. And we kind of, tried to guide them. So I don't think we try to hold it against somebody that they don't know our system. So I don't think that's, even though the staff, I'm sure, tries their best to apprise them and give them examples and whatever, I don't think it's, when homeowners come with fences that they put up in front of their house in Queens somewhere, we're not going to make it hard for them if they're trying to comply. So that's one kind of response to that question. The other kind is when an architect who's a pro shows up and does a bad job, and it smells like neglect or just a lack of a desire to do one's job. I think our view is a little bit more intolerant, perhaps. But again, when you see this many things, you kind of know what it is they're doing and where the problem points are. And either we send them back to fix it, or we tell them yes or no based on the merits of the proposal, not based on the quality of their work, with the knowledge that the staff will ultimately work it out, and that in the end, it's the file drawings that matter. When people come to the commission, they're just showing up with basically slightly improved presentation drawings. They haven't filed at the building department, or at least they may have filed to get an initial review, but they haven't finished because they can't finish without landmarks.
Yeah.
But the staff looks at the final drawings pretty carefully, because that's where the rubber really does meet the road. That's where the engineers have had a chance to throw vents in places that you didn't want them to put them, or where an air conditioner guy wants to put a vent, a louver through a wall, all that kind of little stuff that really can wreck a job is supposed to be reviewed by the staff before the final permit is issued. So even if somebody shows up at a commission and doesn't do a great job, hopefully there are other methods to catch them before they do a really bad job.
And what would you say constitutes a winning presentation for some of the best in the market?
Exactly. It varies based on the project. I don't think I could really answer that question in a way that would be satisfying. I think that, we see things that are very meticulous, step by step, that are very thorough and that cover, touch all the bases. There's a form to it that the staff can show you, like depending on what kind of job it is. You know what you have to have in your drawing set. You have to have site plan, pictures, whatever. So there's that kind of base level of competence. Then there's, I think for me personally, the kind that are most interesting are the ones where somebody's trying to do something interesting, and where the building or the proposal or the modification is trying to engage in a dialogue with the history of the place. And that dialogue can take the form of something that is historicist, or it can take the form of something that is not. And I think that when one kind of engages in that process of creating something new that's supposed to talk to something old, that's interesting, and that can be fun. So that's how I would answer it.
And that's a real sophistication.
Yeah, you gotta
To get to that
you gotta know
place.
what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. To that end, just talking about people having to come before the commission and do their presentations. Of course, we know that research always plays a great part, and I was just curious as to what extent research informs your work as a historic rehabilitation strategist.
Well, I always, when I get called in to help a client kind of think about a project, I mean, hopefully it's before they've, got the contractor waiting to, get started. And hopefully there's some time that we can kind of think things through. I always start with looking at what's there and sort of trying to read in and crack the code of, why does it seem like there's so many kind of layers, or, there's that quirky thing over there, like how does that kind of, what does that tell about the story of this house? And then you dig into the archives and you can kind of piece together some of that. I don't consider myself a great researcher, so I think that's when I turn to somebody like you, who really knows how to do that deed research, look at the maps, find that history. I think that that's a great partnership where I'm working with a historian, I'm working with an architect, I'm working with people who are very strong in their lanes, and together we're putting together the story and the strategy.
I see.
Yeah.
And I was also curious about when you do come up against the quirky stuff, the 1930s, whatever, when you're dealing with an 1880s house, what is your overall, sometimes that stuff can be very
Well, exactly. It can,
attractive.
Yeah, it's always that question of like, where do you draw the line? Like, where do you say that the 50s ranch doesn't fit into the story of Douglaston? Or, like, how do you decide, like, what merits, what's significant versus what's just sort of an anomaly? And that's always, that's always tough. And it's also impossible to get inside the minds of people who did these things. Because, how often do you run into something and you're like, what were they thinking? Like, why? And so then, and it's like, you're constantly trying to balance those things. And again, coming from the place of like, who am I to undo this at this point? Like, who am I to make this decision? Sometimes I'm the right person to make that decision, and sometimes I'm going to punt it to the next generation, because I think we could look back on this in the future, and this is something that's worth preserving. So that's try to be philosophical like
It
that.
might have its own value later
Yeah,
on.
exactly.
Yeah. Kevin, I was curious about, because you do have this preservation advocacy, this passion, how do you reconcile sometimes when you're working with a client within a historic context that, for instance, wants a big expansion, but the preservation side of you is saying that's not really appropriate, or how? Well, I
That's a good question.
I understand everyone's supposed to please the client, but I'm curious about.
Usually it's about money.
Okay.
And so that kills a lot of things very, very quickly. So Kate knows this because we've been talking about it a little bit. I do an analysis before I plunge into design. And I do some basic design diagrams. I also do historic research, whether it's in a New York City district or it's up in Connecticut. It doesn't matter. I do something because I want to know what this building is about. But when I do the analysis, it sorts through what people really want to spend money for. And the minute they know what they want to spend money for, there's a lot of stuff that just goes away. And suddenly they realize, especially in a place like Douglaston, where the houses are both expensive and they're tight lots, suddenly they realize, oh, we never used the living room, maybe that should be the family room, and do something else with the dining room, and not take up the last 20 feet of the backyard that's buildable space. So that's a strategy, and that usually works. So far, I haven't had anyone say to me, I want to do this, and just looked at them and left and thought, oh my God, that's horrible. I usually have vetted them before that moment, because I've been doing this for a long time. In the beginning, I didn't have clients who had that kind of money, but things change. So that's what I do.
And I'm sure all three of you share in common with your private practices this idea of needing to really understand your client's needs, but also what is feasible or doable and what's going to be falling within the budget. I was curious that, Michael, if your firm ever comes across historic buildings, but they're not designated, and how do you approach, is it basically, could be that you want a tabula rasa and just replace it, or?
It's 7:30. At 3 this afternoon, I visited a job in Ridgewood, where a friend who wants our firm to do it with them, brought me to a church that has approved plans for renovation into a single family, or not multifamily building. And the plans are awful. Witheringly, painfully awful. But they're approved, and they started the work. And so this friend of mine and I went there, and we looked around. Regrettably, the facade's gone, but the interior has these gorgeous wood arches, Gothic arches, that we're trying to convince the guy to retain. So I think that the answer to the question is, if we get something historic, we try to keep it for the reasons that Kate said.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do environmentally, it's the right thing to do culturally, it's the right thing to do budget-wise, generally speaking, not always, but often. It's just, and it yields a better project. I obviously haven't done anything in New York City districts for a number of years now, but whenever I get a chance to do something that's either not New York City or not in a district, I certainly try to make the best of it, just because people like it. People like it. People like old stuff.
Yep. All right, so love to hear from you if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask our panelists. Or not.
Well, another thing to think about is, for instance, I'm thinking about that big tower now that's at the 5th and 29th at the southwest corner, and the idea of zoning and view corridors, for instance. Never really something that's like a big issue in Landmarks, but I remember having been on the community board in Landmarks, Community Board 5, we had reviewed a tower that was supposed to go up around opposite Altman's, and the community board said no because it's too close to the Empire State Building, it's going to compete, and then of course Boston's building went up. But now this building is like, it just seems like a no-brainer that it wouldn't get passed. So how did it get passed?
There are no provisions in the New York City landmarks law for the creation of view corridors. Do I wish that there were? I don't think I should comment publicly, but you can make your own conclusions. But it would be an act of legislature to create that, and were they to do so, I would gleefully enforce it if I were given the chance.
Well, there wasn't a real issue with the previous proposal by Altman's that said, oh, it's competing with the Empire State Building. We respect the Empire State Building. We're not going to put a building like 2 blocks away from it. But even though there's no legislation, there's no like view corridor like requirement.
But it wasn't in a district. The building, the plot of land on which that tower exists is not one that is covered by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. You just can't go into somebody's backyard and say, you know what? We're going to mess around in your backyard even though you're not designated. It's a legal process. It's an encumbrance, right? If I landmark your house, all of a sudden, you have to spend extra money to apply to landmarks. You have to spend extra money that you can't put in that Home Depot door that you wanted to put in. You know, you've got to do stuff. So people view this very seriously, and it is serious. So it has to be done according to the law. Otherwise, you'll sue me or sue the commission and you'll win. And you'll put on whatever door you want.
Sure, it may not have been plotted in the landmark district, but it affected the landmark district.
The nature of that effect was not governed by the Landmarks Commission, right? In other words, it's the way that the law is written. And like all laws, it's written for a general condition that doesn't always fit every individual situation. The general condition is that when you look at a building from, if you're applying to modify building X, and you can see building X from the public way, then those changes to building X are governed by a review process. If you're talking about a building that's way the hell over there, like LaGuardia, the IMP Towers, and I choose to do something over here that blocks the view of it on a non-designated property, that action is not covered by our landmarks law. No matter what you do.
Designated.
Unless you designate this.
No, it's designated as a landmark property. How you affect him doesn't.
That's right. The law is written to address a common but not universal situation. In your case, it is not addressed.
I think it's an important point, though, that the landmarks law in New York City, it's a very strong law, but it has its limitations. It's not a universal planning tool, and I think that, that's always been something that, we bump up against, is that it doesn't apply to every kind of area where you want to impact the aesthetics or the scale of the city or things like that. It's not a planning tool that applies in a lot of cases. That said, the landmarks law has been changed several times in its history. I mean, it was, revised to create historic districts. It was revised to include interiors. So there have been moments where, that the law has been opened up and they've changed it to be more inclusive. As I recall, people were very concerned in, recent years about, you open that up and it's like a Pandora's box, because politically we're not in a place where anything good could come out of opening up the landmarks law. Because if you do that, you take this very strong law, and yet there's always a possibility of weakening that law. So there's been, trepidation about that.
So-
And you,
No, I was not even going to address that.
Okay.
That's the tombstone of the Douglas and Hill, the Douglas and extension, was that messing with it in 2016. But, putting that aside, on the panel, you've got, Commissioner Goldman, who's been there for 15 years, Kevin, we've all, quite a long time. Kate, in your experience, what percentage, just roughly, do you think, of projects actually get rejected at commission level?
when it goes to the full commission?
Yeah.
Very few. I mean,
You're saying all out rejection?
Yeah, just
As
like,
opposed
like,
to comments?
a commission
come back.
says yes, no, modify. But I mean, and
and then the
talk about that.
application tends to stay open for a very long time. But in that time, I mean, as I recall, the application could, if it wasn't approved within the first couple of hearings, they would leave the application open. And then, there'd be a lot of conversations internally, and the hearing would close, and then the public was no longer kind of part of that conversation. And so, I mean, yeah, at that point, probably a lot of things would just, I think everything, do you know what the percentages of things that actually just got rejected by the commission?
It's my question, I'm not gonna answer. I don't know, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
It's a very small number.
Yes.
But I think that the reason that it's a small number, I would hope, or I would state as my opinion, is not because we are a rubber stamp that approves everything that is put in front of us, but rather because the staff kind of knows what it is that will get approved, and if they don't think it's going to get approved, it will not come to the commission.
I remember years ago, the advice of the staff was, if you have our support, you probably have a 97% chance of making it through here. And if you don't have staff.
I think that's accurate, and I think that in the projects that get rejected are relatively few, and that's because the people who get rejected are the people who want to show it to the commission, even though they've been told it sucks. And they want to do it because an owner says, you know, those bastards, whatever, I reject the whole notion of being governed by those people, I want to do what I want to do, or some other reason of that nature. And they just force the issue, and staff eventually will say, you know, it's your funeral, and they get rejected. You know, I would say that for projects that are deeply inappropriate, the commission will do what Kate said, which is review it, comment on it. Those can also be, you know, of a similar nature where the developer, the owner just said, I'm going to show them that 70-story building, I don't care what you say. Let's see what happens. You know, a lot of people engage in this kind of calculation that, you know, let's show them something really awful and big, and then we'll negotiate it down. Terrible idea. But a lot of people hold, not always, not often.
So I would
I would
actually
say
like
no.
to go back to the prior question and ask it from a slightly different angle. I chair the land use committee for CB12 in Manhattan, and we had an actual project where there are two abutting historic districts, and the proposed project was literally on the line, so it's in one district, but if you went to the other side, it means it's another. And the question that was raised is, does LPC consider the impact of the building in one historic district on the other? And the answer we got was no. And that was very surprising because, you know, unlike the prior question where one area was not designated and one was, in this case, there are two LPC designated districts separated by, you know, an imaginary line. And they said, we don't consider how building X would impact the building right next to it. I will send you the email, but.
Was it a staff person?
I believe so. It didn't make sense.
I can tell you this, that I can't speak for what the law says, because I'm not the staff attorney, but I can tell you that if a project was presented with those conditions to the commission would certainly take that into consideration. It's of course, completely 100% for sure.
Did you have a question?
I did, and I was wondering if you have a chance to network with other design professionals from the metro areas that are struggling with some of the same issues, historical preservation, view corridors, trying to develop a common aesthetic in particular neighborhoods. I mean, what resources are available to you?
As far as networking,
Yeah.
I mean, there's the statewide conferences that happen every year. I always go to those because, I mean, it's where I run into people I haven't seen in a long time. Conferences, I think, are a really great resource.
I asked the question because I most of my career was in a highly regulated community, and we had a lot of influence actually from the West Coast on how, particularly on landscape preservation. And I was just, but New York is so unique, it's hard, I guess it's hard to garner design ideas or design regulations from others, but.
I think that, I mean, first of all, it would be remiss not to mention the building in which we sit as a major source of that kind of networking. The AIA has preservation committees, and there's lots of people in the preservation subcategory who are architects who participate in AIA programs like this one. I think in terms of New York being different, it surely is, and its law is different than other laws in many interesting and impactful ways. But that doesn't mean that there's not plenty to learn from other places. I would hope that the people who are writing the regulations would be educating themselves on what those other regulations are. But like Kate said, it's a very fraught thing to consider messing with the law because of the time we're in and because of the fact is that I think people perceive that it works more than it doesn't. And there are lots of forces that would want it to be different in a way that would be less protective. And there's once you open that door, you know what's going to happen.
And I think just to add to what you're saying, so the State Historic Preservation Office Conference, they have an annual conference.
The Preservation League of New York State and the Landmarks Society of Western New York,
There you
they go
go.
back and forth between hosting the statewide conference, either kind of downstate or, out upstate.
There's also the CLG program, which is certified
Yes.
government, and there's a program within the State Historic Preservation Office, and they, I mean, at least when I used to talk to them, they sort of liaise with all of the local governments that have landmark laws. And I used to work on Long Island, and millions of little villages that have their own version of a landmarks law or a regulation to deal with historic districts. And so at the conference, they've had a couple of meetings and trainings, because a lot of these, they're all volunteers, and they don't really have the same capacity like in New York City to have paid staff that go to school to learn how to do this stuff. And so they had a whole little program, and I think there was some guidelines that they had. So that's definitely a resource.
So,
They talk to
Okay,
you.
pardon me. We have about 20 minutes more that we can stay in this room, so I'm going to suggest maybe we stop the formal discussion and turn it into, maybe feel free to ask the people on the panel individual questions, and there's refreshments in the back, and we could take 20 minutes to say hi.
but thank you all for coming.